Hey guys, tonight we begin in a village square filled with the scent of damp hay, the faint whiff of sheep, and the unmistakable grumble of collective disbelief. The sky is overcast, as if even the weather is unsure how to feel about what's happening. A wooden platform stands in the center, hastily cobbled together, and already sagging slightly under the weight of its most unusual occupant, a pig. Not a symbolic pig, not an embroidered crest or a theatrical puppet. A real, muddy, snuffling pig, tethered loosely to a post and curiously eyeing a nearby cabbage. And no, you're not hallucinating. You're about to watch a medieval criminal trial for a pig. You probably won't survive this century, not because of war or plague, but because your brain might simply short-circuit from the sheer oddness of it all. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me where you're listening from, and what time it is there. I'm always curious which corners of the world this sleepy little show reaches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle forward slowly, boots squelching slightly in the muck as villagers gather around. Cloaks are pulled tighter, hoods peek out cautiously, and someone hands a roasted chestnut to a child who can't decide whether this is terrifying or hilarious. The town crier is unrolling a scroll, clearing his throat with the gravity of a man about to announce something truly ridiculous. Which he is. The pig is accused of murder. Specifically, of attacking and killing a child. The exact circumstances are murky. Was the child teasing it, feeding it, simply in the wrong place? No one seems to know. Or perhaps they've all quietly agreed not to say. What matters now, to everyone present, is the trial. The appearance of justice. The performance of order. This wasn't as unusual as it sounds. In 13th century France, and other corners of medieval Europe, animals could be, and were, placed on trial. For crimes. Real legal proceedings, complete with clerks, judges, and sometimes, legal representation. This is not metaphor. This is actual parchment-stamped reality. The pig snorts again, nudging its rope with a tiny bit more focus, possibly wondering if anyone's brought a snack. It doesn't appear anxious. It does not understand the stakes. It's just a pig. One with muddy hooves and surprisingly soulful eyes. A robed figure steps forward, the magistrate, or judge, depending on how grand this particular town's council wants to sound today. He glances at the scroll, nods once, and addresses the crowd. His voice is serious, precise, and vaguely irritated, as if he's done this before and really thought he wouldn't have to do it again. But here we are. He begins the formal statement of accusation, that this pig, belonging to a man whose name is conveniently missing from the document, did feloniously and in a beastly manner attack a human child, resulting in said child's death. There's a pause. Then the judge turns to the pig, as custom demands, and asks if it has anything to say in its defense. Naturally, it does not. A rooster crows in the background, as if mocking the entire process. Historians still argue whether these animal trials were symbolic acts of communal catharsis or actual attempts at jurisprudence. The answer, it seems, is both. On paper, these were legitimate legal procedures. Courts were convened, witnesses summoned, clerks scribbled furiously in the margins. But in spirit, they were theatrical rituals. Medieval justice wasn't just about logic or retribution. It was about affirming cosmic order. And sometimes, affirming that order meant making a pig stand trial for murder. You glance around. The villagers are utterly engrossed. Some nod gravely, others whisper behind gloved hands. A few children are hoisted onto shoulders for a better view. It's not every day you see a pig on trial. Even back then. The local priest stands near the judge, ready to weigh in on whether the pig's crime also demands spiritual consequences. There's talk of excommunication, though whether that means much to an animal with no understanding of original sin is another question entirely. Still, it's important to check the boxes. To complete the ritual. To say, yes, we responded to the crime with seriousness and formality. Even if the accused can't recite the Lord's Prayer. Some scholars have suggested that these trials served a social purpose beyond their absurdity. In rural villages with no centralized police force, such rituals provided a way to manage grief and anger. A child is lost, and a scapegoat, even a literal one with curly tail and twitchy ears, becomes the focus of communal mourning. It gives people something to do, a way to grieve that looks like justice. A murmur runs through the crowd. The judge is inspecting a torn tunic that supposedly belonged to the victim. The pig stares off into the middle distance, unimpressed. You lean against a wooden fence, watching. It's hard to know how seriously to take any of it. And yet, no one's laughing. Not out loud. The solemnity is real, even if the logic isn't. Someone near you mumbles, "At least it wasn't a goose this time." You file that comment away for later. The trial is adjourned for lunch, and you follow the crowd toward a thatched tavern that smells faintly of onions, cider, and damp wool. You've never seen a courtroom recess where the defendant goes back to rooting through the mud like nothing happened. But then, you've never been to a trial quite like this before. Still, the day's only just begun. You rejoin the crowd after the recess, a smear of gravy on your sleeve and the lingering taste of turnip stew still clinging to your tongue. The pig trial resumes with a quiet intensity that makes you wonder, not for the first time, how this entire phenomenon got started. Who looked at a wayward goat or an unruly sow and thought, "This creature must face the full weight of the law"? The pig is back on the platform, its hooves leaving vague prints on the damp planks. No one bothers wiping them. The judge looks slightly refreshed, or at least less grumpy, which may be due to ale rather than moral clarity. He bangs a short wooden rod against a bell to signal the next phase. A witness steps forward. A wiry man with hay in his hood and a voice that sounds like it hasn't spoken above a whisper in years. He claims to have seen the pig in question lurking near the scene of the crime. There's some speculation as to whether the pig looked guilty. Someone in the back nods as if this is a useful metric. This wasn't the first time pigs faced the bench. In fact, by the 13th century, France had already seen multiple pig-related prosecutions. One particularly famous case in Falaise in 1386 saw a pig executed in full public ceremony, complete with human clothes and a solemn procession, after allegedly mauling a child. The town spared no expense. A tailor was even paid to dress the pig in a waistcoat. And you think your local tax dollars are misused? Historians still argue whether these displays were about animal punishment or human performance. The pig becomes a stand-in for chaos, nature ungoverned, instinct run wild. To tame it, publicly and with flair, was to reassert control. Back in the courtroom, courtyard, the judge scribbles something down. A clerk stands nearby with a parchment already curling at the edges. He uses a quill that's seen better days, occasionally shaking it out like a chicken drying its wings. Now comes the legal defense. A pig's lawyer. Not in a wearing robes and quoting Cicero sort of way, but in the form of a notary or legal scholar hired by the animal's owner, whose name still doesn't appear on any formal documentation. Probably on purpose. It's easier to watch your pig stand trial than to be tried yourself for negligence. The advocate makes an impassioned speech about the pig's inability to reason, about its lack of moral compass, and, somewhat bizarrely, about its otherwise good character. Apparently, it had never bitten anyone before. Unless you count the baker, but everyone knows that was about stale crusts, not malice. The audience listens respectfully. The priest occasionally nods. The pig sneezes. There's a brief debate about whether this sneeze should be considered testimony. It is not. You glance again at the torn tunic, the primary evidence in this case, and notice it's been mended at least once. It's not clear whether this speaks to frugality, tragedy, or just general medieval textile practices. One woman in the crowd suggests perhaps the child fell. Another mutters that pigs don't just snap like that without provocation. Someone else says it must have been demons. You realize that, in a weird way, this trial is less about guilt and more about story. People need a version of events they can wrap their heads around. One that involves justice, even if the logic is fuzzy and the defendant has a curly tail. The judge calls a short recess for prayer. Everyone bows their heads. The pig uses this time to dig at a suspicious patch of earth with surprising determination. You try not to think too hard about what it's looking for. There's a moment where the sun almost breaks through the clouds, casting a pale light across the square. It highlights the worn edges of wooden homes, the fraying hems of cloaks, and the collective quiet of people waiting for something to make sense. These trials weren't unique to pigs. Medieval Europe saw proceedings against all sorts of animals: bulls, dogs, roosters, even insects. One especially colorful case involved a swarm of locusts, which were excommunicated after destroying crops. That one, you assume, lacked a public hanging. Still, the idea persisted. The belief that justice, true, divine, enforceable justice, could and should be enacted on all living beings, even the ones who oink. You overhear someone explain the term bestiality to a confused child, not in the modern context, but as a way to describe the line between the human world and everything else. These trials, the adult insists, reinforce that line. You wonder if the child buys it. The priest returns, this time with a slightly stern expression. He speaks briefly about sin, community, and moral order. Then he asks for divine guidance in reaching a verdict. The pig, oblivious, licks its own shoulder and blinks at a buzzing fly. There's a stillness now. A lull in the chatter. You feel the weight of the moment settling, not because it's a turning point in legal history, but because everyone involved is trying very hard to pretend it matters deeply. The magistrate clears his throat. A decision is close. You back away a few steps, unsure if you want to witness what comes next. Not because you're squeamish, but because there's something strangely intimate about the scene, a whole town investing meaning into a drama that's part justice, part theater, part coping mechanism. You find yourself wishing the pig could speak. Not to clear its name, but just to offer a perspective the rest of us will never have. Or to confirm whether it really was about stale bread and a poorly timed head pat. Instead, you return to your spot on the fence and wait. The magistrate finally stands, and for a moment, everything else stills. Even the pig freezes mid-snuffle, perhaps sensing the gravity of the moment, or just enjoying a patch of sun warming the platform. Either way, it's oddly dramatic. The townsfolk lean in. You do too, even though you're well aware that the verdict, whether guilt or innocence, won't exactly shake the kingdom. The judge begins with a long preamble, thanking the witnesses, praising the solemnity of the occasion, and reminding everyone that justice must be impartial, even when the accused has 4 legs and no idea what's going on. He then delivers the verdict: guilty. The pig is to be executed the next morning. By hanging. You blink. Hanging. For a pig. It's not uncommon, though. Hanging was the go-to punishment for condemned pigs in this period, at least in France. The logic? A human punishment for a human-like crime. Some towns even paid executioners extra for animal duty, which came with less glory and more snorting. You overhear someone in the crowd whisper that the execution will be at dawn. A few people look satisfied. Others just seem tired. A child starts crying, not for the pig, but because someone stepped on her foot. Still, the mood shifts from tense to quietly resigned. The judge sits down heavily. Someone hands him a goblet of something dark and probably fermented. The priest offers a prayer over the pig, and you can't help but imagine the Almighty's reaction, a raised celestial eyebrow, perhaps. The pig, meanwhile, returns to its usual activities, rooting, sniffing, ignoring the swirl of theology and jurisprudence that's now branded it a criminal. You wonder if pigs dream. If they do, this one might be dreaming of cabbages or rolling in warm hay, not of makeshift scaffolds and indignant lawyers. After the crowd disperses, you find yourself walking the long path home, boots crunching on half-frozen earth. Along the way, you pass a few villagers deep in conversation. They're not talking about the crime, or justice, or divine wrath. They're speculating about whether the local blacksmith is courting the miller's daughter. The pig's fate, dramatic just an hour ago, has already begun fading into the fabric of daily gossip. But for the record books, and oh yes, there were record books, the pig's trial will be noted. With names, dates, charges, punishment, Some scribes went so far as to include the pig's reputation in court documents, describing it as ill-tempered or not previously troublesome. These were, after all, legal matters. Accuracy mattered, even if the defendant didn't understand vowels. Historians still argue whether these trials reflect sincere beliefs or bureaucratic farce. Maybe both. In a world where divine order mattered more than empirical evidence, it was easier to project morality onto everything, even livestock. And speaking of livestock, pigs weren't the only animals who ran afoul of medieval law. Dogs were tried for biting. Roosters for laying eggs. Yes, you read that right. A rooster that laid an egg was viewed as demonic, and thus put on trial. Nature's quirks weren't charming back then. They were suspicious. One record even notes a donkey tried for unseemly behavior with a human, though in that case, the donkey was acquitted. Local clergy determined it was an innocent victim of seduction, which really raises more questions than it answers. You arrive home just as the sun slips behind the trees, casting long shadows across the village. Inside, the hearth is still warm. A pot of something vaguely edible simmers on the stones. You sit, pull off your boots, and stare into the flames, feeling the strange weight of the day settle into your limbs. The fire crackles softly. You sip something from a chipped mug, thin ale or thick broth, it's hard to tell. Outside, someone's goat yells. You flinch, irrationally wondering if it, too, has committed a capital offense. Your neighbor pokes her head in, announces she's making a stew and wonders if you've got any time. You don't. She leaves, disappointed but undeterred. Gossip, after all, needs fuel, and missing herbs make excellent conversation starters. The next morning dawns gray and chilly. The execution platform has been cleaned, sort of. A rope has been strung. It looks far too ceremonial for what's about to happen. The pig arrives, escorted by 2 men and a boy chewing on a piece of bark. The boy looks bored. The pig looks confused. The crowd, noticeably smaller than yesterday, assembles with the hushed reverence of a funeral. Or a particularly dull market day. The priest says a few words. The judge looks on with what might be regret, or a hangover. The executioner ties the rope with practiced efficiency. You find yourself hoping it will be quick, even though part of you is still questioning whether this should be happening at all. One last oink. Then silence. And just like that, it's over. The crowd disperses again, faster this time. Life beckons. Bread must be baked. Fields tended. Rumors updated. You remain behind a moment longer, gazing at the now empty platform. It's already being dismantled. The rope is tossed into a basket like just another tool. In a day or two, this space will be used for something else, perhaps a sermon, or a puppet show. In the grand sweep of medieval history, these animal trials occupy a curious little corner. A place where justice was less about logic and more about maintaining cosmic balance. Where humans projected order onto chaos, and pigs paid the price. You finally turn to go, boots crunching again, thoughts swirling. You suspect this won't be the last strange tale to emerge from the annals of medieval law. But for now, you've witnessed the curious case of a pig and the people who believed it mattered. You walk back through the village with the sort of slow, thoughtful pace usually reserved for monks or people who've just watched a pig hang for murder. The streets are muddy but familiar, and each crooked house seems to exhale a bit of wood smoke or stew-scented comfort. A woman you vaguely know is sweeping her doorstep with the resigned energy of someone who's been sweeping the same patch of dirt since sunrise. She doesn't mention the trial. She doesn't have to. Because in medieval towns like this one, these trials, odd as they were, didn't feel like spectacles. They were part of the rhythm of things, wedged in somewhere between feast days and fumigating the rushes. You're still mulling this over when you pass the scribe's quarters. A boy is outside sharpening a quill with a little knife. He looks about 10 years old, and already done with humanity. Inside, ink-stained fingers are scribbling the pig's verdict into the court ledger, in Latin no less. There's no rush. These records are kept with eerie diligence. It's the sort of attention modern bureaucrats could only dream of. The clerk hums softly as he writes, and you catch a glimpse of the entry, Porcus reus homicidii, suspendendus, You lean against the doorframe for a moment, and wonder how much shelf space in European monasteries was taken up by the detailed legal fates of farm animals. Probably more than anyone's ready to admit. One interesting thing about these scribes, their jobs weren't just about copying scripture. They handled contracts, property disputes, and yes, animal indictments. Their writing desks are stacked with documents like petition concerning the theft of a goose or complaint regarding turnip trespass. Some documents even bear little wax seals, just to make sure everyone knows a pig-related verdict is official. Historians still argue whether this administrative thoroughness was meant to impress the divine, scare the peasants, or simply keep bored clerks entertained. You duck into the adjacent chapel for warmth. Inside, it smells like candles, old stone, and lingering incense. A stained glass panel features St. Hubert and a very well-behaved deer. No pigs in sight. You sit for a while, letting the cool quiet settle around your shoulders like a woolen cloak. A monk shuffles by and nods. You ask him, gently, if the church ever objected to pig trials. He squints and replies that the devil has many disguises. Apparently, that includes snorting and rolling in compost. Outside again, you wander toward the edge of the village, where the forest starts pressing in. There's an old superstition that animals in the woods speak more clearly at twilight. Probably started as a fairy tale, but in places where wolves eat your sheep and owls sound like souls in agony, it's not hard to imagine how people blurred the lines between beast and villain. You pause under an old oak and let the wind rustle through your hood. There's something ancient in the air, older than law or Latin, older than rope or ritual. Maybe that's what people feared most, the idea that the world was untamable, its creatures unpredictable. Charging a pig, bizarre as it sounds, was an attempt to make sense of that wildness. Back in town, the baker is yelling at a stray dog. You wonder if it'll be on trial by Thursday. As dusk settles in, the tavern lights flicker to life. You're drawn in, partly by habit, partly by the promise of warmth. Inside, it's dim and smoky, filled with the quiet murmur of villagers discussing mundane things, grain prices, whether or not the tavern's ale tastes like turnip water this week. At a corner table, two older men are debating the pig's guilt. One insists it was provoked. The other swears he saw the pig with a look in its eyes. You sip your drink and marvel at how seriously they're taking it. There's something oddly comforting about that. A world where pig psychology is worthy of a pint and a philosophical debate is a world where people care, even if what they care about makes no sense. A bard sets up by the hearth, tuning an instrument with more strings than common sense. You half expect him to sing about noble knights and tragic love, but no, his first ballad is about the pig. It's a slow, melancholic number with suspiciously good rhyming couplets. Someone requests it be played again. And then you remember that in many medieval towns, public executions were followed by feasts. Not for the criminal, obviously, but for everyone else. You ask the tavern keeper, who nods solemnly. Tomorrow, there will be roast pork served with mustard and bread. You pause with your mug halfway to your lips, uncertain whether to be appalled or impressed by the efficiency. It's hard to know what the townspeople are really thinking. Do they believe justice was done? Do they think the pig deserved a fair trial? Or is it all just pageantry now, the same way we still hold parades for holidays half the attendees can't explain? You finish your ale and step back outside. The air's colder now, and stars are beginning to gather overhead like tiny frost motes stuck to the heavens. As you walk home, you think of all the odd bits of medieval law that haven't made it into modern memory. Like the rule in Flanders that a man could challenge a neighbor to trial by combat over a goat. Or the case where a swarm of locusts was excommunicated for damaging crops. That one involved a bishop, a lot of incense, and an angry sermon delivered to thin air. Some scholars suggest that these trials help people feel less powerless. That punishing the animal responsible, even symbolically, gave a sense of closure. Others argue it was all just a theatrical reminder of divine order, everything in its place, even justice for pigs. You stop at your doorway, hand on the latch, and look back once more toward the square. It's quiet now. No platforms, no judges, no pigs. Just a village settling into night, its odd rituals tucked into memory and parchment alike. And you? You're not sure you understand it all. But maybe understanding isn't the point. Maybe it's enough to bear witness to the strange ways people have tried to bring order to a noisy, nonsensical world. You step inside and shut the door softly behind you. The morning comes gently, no clanging bells or rooster drama, just the pale yawn of light sliding in through the shutters. You rub the sleep from your eyes and remember, with an odd sense of calm, that today is the aftermath. The trial is over. The pig is gone. The town resumes. But as you dress, you realize that the legal drama hasn't quite exited the village stage. Down by the smithy, two men are arguing over whether the pig's legal representation was adequate. Apparently, a local friar had spoken on behalf of the sow, citing biblical compassion and livestock ignorance. You weren't there for that part, but word spreads faster than a spilled mead barrel in this place. One of the men insists the pig was clearly guilty. The other leans on the friar's argument that a creature lacking moral awareness shouldn't be held to human law. You sip your watered cider and nod slowly, as if you've weighed these legal complexities for years. Historians still argue whether these animal trials were sincere attempts at justice or just social rituals with a strong seasoning of absurdity. You lean toward the latter, but who's to say where ritual ends and belief begins? You stroll toward the fields, passing the old market cross. A boy's carving something into its base, possibly his name, possibly a goat. You don't ask. The town has resumed its chores. Someone's scouring a cauldron that seems to have survived 6 different plagues. A woman is hauling turnips with the gravity of a tax collector. The rhythm of village life doesn't allow for much pause. Even the pigs, those not accused of murder, are already back to grunting near the compost heap. You eye them carefully. They seem indifferent to the fate of their fallen comrade, perhaps proving the point about moral awareness. Further down the lane, you pass the butcher, who has a new sign in the window, "Today's special, court-cleared pork." It's hard to tell if that's meant as dark humor or clever marketing. Either way, the line is long. And it reminds you, this wasn't the first pig trial. Far from it. In 1386, in the town of Falaise, a pig was tried and executed for attacking a child. It wore a tiny outfit to match the executioner's uniform. That part is somehow the most disturbing. You imagine a pig in a bonnet and grimace slightly. There were rules about these things, too. A pig on trial had to be held in the local jail. It needed representation, usually a cleric or a notary. The entire village was invited to watch. The sentence? Often hanging, but sometimes mutilation first if the offense involved royal livestock or an especially unpopular farmer. What surprises modern minds most isn't that the trials happened, but how methodically they were carried out. Full transcripts exist. Testimonies were heard. Evidence, hoofprints, teeth marks, and all was evaluated. This wasn't slapstick. It was law. One fringe theory claims these trials had less to do with pigs and more to do with controlling people. A symbolic execution, played out through a pig, could reinforce rules without spilling human blood. An indirect warning, if justice can hang a pig, it can reach you too. There's another theory, slightly more entertaining, that suggests the trials were part of an elaborate, community-wide stress relief. A tragic event, a child injured, a crop ruined, was followed by a ritual performance. The pig trials served as both theater and catharsis. You stop by the town square, where a few lads are attempting to teach a dog to confess. One holds a stick. The dog, smarter than it looks, simply lays down and plays dead. They cheer. There's always been something performative about medieval justice. Trials were public. Punishments were symbolic. Even the stocks had a sort of carnival energy. Bread was thrown, jokes were shouted, and yet somehow the system still marched forward. Back at your home, you spread out a few parchments that survived your uncle's curiosity cabinet. One details a 15th century case where a rooster was tried for laying an egg, an act deemed unnatural and therefore suspicious. The verdict? Executed for heresy. You pause. Not for the verdict, but for the sheer audacity of blaming a chicken for gender confusion in the 1400s. Next to it is an account of rats being summoned to court. Yes, summoned. They didn't show up, of course, and a lengthy debate followed over whether they could be punished in absentia. A defense lawyer reportedly argued the rats had not received safe passage and feared for their lives. The court accepted the excuse. No, really. Historians still argue whether these animal cases were ever believed to be real justice or simply formal pageants, structured performances that echoed sacred rituals or ancient taboos. The bell in the chapel chimes for midday prayer. You step outside again, half expecting to hear new rumors of an alpaca trial or a goose defamation suit. Instead, the townsfolk are talking about the weather. The harvest looks promising. Someone mentions a traveling bard with a puppet show that may or may not include a pig jury. You hope it does. You head to the baker's, hoping for honeyed oatcakes and not another spirited debate about porcine guilt. The baker nods solemnly, and hands you one still warm from the hearth. You sit on a bench in the sunlight and take a slow bite. Maybe this is the strangest part of all, how something as bizarre as putting a pig on trial can become so completely, mundanely normal. People go on. Meals are eaten. Children play. The absurdity folds into the fabric of daily life like an ink blot on linen, noticeable, but not jarring. The village bell rings once more, and for a moment, the square is quiet. Peaceful. Even the pigs seem to sense that, for now, their legal troubles are behind them. You lean back and smile. You're back on your feet now, ambling past the last few merchant stalls as the afternoon sun slants golden across the cobblestones. It casts a sleepy, almost saintly light over everything, even the pigsty, where the remaining pigs wallow with the kind of unbothered confidence you'd expect from livestock recently cleared of moral suspicion. Still, the echoes of that trial linger. You overhear two nuns discussing it by the well, one solemn, one clearly holding back laughter. God's will, one says. Or a very clever precedent, says the other. You suspect both are right. You pause by the scribe's bench, a plank balanced on barrels, really, where he's dutifully transcribing yesterday's proceedings into the town records. His handwriting is careful but slow, and you can't help but notice the margins are already filled with doodles of pigs in robes. One even has a tiny gavel. This isn't entirely inaccurate. Many of these trials followed strict formulas. Opening prayers, witness testimony, legal citations, even. The Code of Justinian, yes, that ancient Roman pile of scrolls, was still quoted in some of these rural trials. Scholars would be proud. Or horrified. It's hard to say. Historians still argue whether medieval villagers truly believed animals could sin or if the whole thing was a convenient moral metaphor in an age that dearly loved both order and pageantry. You wander toward the outskirts of the village, where fields stretch out like green patchwork. A shepherd waves to you, then points out a goat that keeps nibbling his bootlaces. If he ruins another pair, the man jokes, I'm calling the bailiff. It's said that pigs weren't the only animals on trial. Dogs, goats, even a troop of locusts once got summoned in a French village. The locusts did not appear, and were found guilty in absentia. The punishment? Prayer and excommunication. Honestly, it's hard to say whether the bugs were deterred. You pass the abbey's stone garden wall, where a few novices are trimming herbs. They nod politely, but you catch a snippet of their conversation, one muttering something about the theological implications of swine repentance. A phrase you never thought you'd hear before lunch. And yet, in a way, it all fits. The medieval mind had room for saints and miracles, dragons and demons, and yes, even law-abiding pigs. Or at least, law-breaking ones who got caught. Inside the abbey, the air is cooler. You find yourself standing beside an old manuscript chained to a lectern. It's written in Latin, illuminated with gold filigree and marginal drawings of animals, many of them mid-trial. You spot a rabbit with scales, a fox giving testimony, a chicken looking guilty. You chuckle quietly. Even the monks had a sense of humor about it. And yet, here's the twist, these trials weren't entirely rare. Dozens are recorded across Europe between the 13th and 18th centuries. France led the charge, but Switzerland, Italy, and parts of Germany chimed in, too. Pigs were most often charged, perhaps because of their close contact with humans. And perhaps because, when riled, a pig is less Winnie the Pooh and more battering ram. In one peculiar case, a pig was posthumously exonerated. Apparently, the court discovered the child that had allegedly harmed had fallen from a hayloft. The pig was cleared, and the farmer was allowed to keep its bacon. Justice served lukewarm. You meander back through the cloister, where someone's lit a brazier. The smell of herbs, rosemary, maybe thyme, drifts through the corridor. A monk passes with a small bundle of parchment, and an expression of deep concentration, as though pondering whether a sheep could commit slander. Outside, the village green has filled with townsfolk once again. There's a traveling musician playing a harp badly, and a woman balancing apples in a basket with the elegance of a court jester. Life, as ever, moves forward. And yet, the echoes of the trial aren't quite done. You notice a cluster of children gathered around one boy who's drawing lines in the dirt with a stick. They're jurors, he explains proudly. We're trying the cat. The others nod gravely. The cat in question, slinking nearby, does not appear overly concerned. Back at your own stoop, you sit and watch the sun inch lower. Someone's chimney begins puffing out dinner smoke. The world smells like onions, bread, and just the faintest whiff of wet hay. It's oddly perfect. You muse that medieval villagers probably never saw this as absurd. This was just law. And for them, law was both sacred and practical, a way to keep peace in a world that often felt ungoverned by reason or fairness. Besides, it gave everyone something to talk about between harvests. You close your eyes and let the last warmth of the day settle across your face. A rooster crows, confused, at the wrong time. A pig grunts in its sleep. Someone down the lane starts playing a flute with questionable talent. In this small, slightly absurd, surprisingly orderly world, even the trials of pigs fit perfectly into the weave of daily life. The laws were strange, the punishments odder, but the people? They got through it, one oat cake and one trial at a time. The sky has gone lavender now, just shy of dusk, the sort of moment when shadows stretch like sleepy cats across the cobblestones. You rise again, shoes dusty from the road, and follow the worn footpath that leads down to the riverbank. A few ducks drift along the current, completely unaware that in certain French villages, their ancestors might once have faced a judge for stealing grain. You find a flat stone near the edge and sit, watching the water swirl lazily by. It's here that a local merchant approaches with a satchel of parchment under one arm and a half-eaten pear in the other. He recognizes your face from the trial and sits beside you without invitation, launching into a story before you can even greet him. Did I ever tell you about the trial of the rooster? He asks, wiping juice from his chin. 15 years ago. Accused of laying an egg. Which, you understand, was considered sorcery. You nod slowly. Yes, you've heard something like that. Roosters laying eggs, specifically the so-called basilisk egg, believed to hatch a creature so deadly it could kill with a glance. Which seems a bit much for a farmyard mishap, but medieval people were not, shall we say, subtle with their symbolism. Historians still argue whether this belief stemmed from confusion between hens and roosters, or a deeper symbolic dread of anything that blurred natural lines. Either way, the rooster was convicted. The egg smashed. The rooster survived, but reportedly never crowed again. You glance at the water, wondering what other animal trials might have slipped through the cracks of recorded history. How many parishes quietly swept them under the rug, or used them as cautionary tales at bedtime? Be good, or you'll end up like the baker's goat. That sort of thing. Back in town, the bells of the church tower begin to toll vespers. You rise, brushing your hands on your tunic, and make your way back toward the village square, where the shadows have deepened and the lamp-bearers have started making their rounds. One pauses beside you to light an oil lantern fixed to the wall, casting a warm flicker against the stone. You hear the pigs are appealing? He says with a smirk. You blink. Joking, he adds. Though there was that cow in Rouen who got her sentence overturned by the bishop. Indeed, appeals weren't unheard of, especially when a village didn't want to pay the fines or surrender an otherwise useful animal. In a few recorded cases, even noblemen stepped in to defend livestock they claimed had been led astray by irresponsible children. You can't help but imagine a pig sitting in the bishop's court, wearing a daisy chain like a repentant maiden. You reach the tavern now, where the common room buzzes with quiet mirth. Someone's drawn a mock wanted poster on the wall. Lost, 1 pig. Answers to your honor. May attempt to flee jurisdiction. You chuckle softly and settle onto a bench near the hearth. A barmaid delivers a wooden cup of something sweet and mildly alcoholic. Probably mead, though it has a faint apple tinge. It slides down like a melted pastry. Across the room, an old man begins recounting his version of today's trial. His tale includes a dramatic chase scene and at least 3 more pigs than were actually present. Oral tradition, you remind yourself, is not built for fact-checking. Still, you enjoy the way his tale spins out like yarn from a spindle, wild, colorful, and vaguely sticky with cider. You overhear someone at the next table describe a story from Switzerland, where a colony of rats was excommunicated for damaging barley stores. The priest reportedly gave them advance notice of their condemnation and time to vacate the premises. The rats, being rats, ignored the summons. Still, the ritual went ahead, complete with witnesses and liturgical chants. You lean back against the wooden post and watch the firelight flicker on the beams overhead. The room smells like wool, roast onion, and peat smoke. A dog lies snoring under a stool, twitching occasionally like it's chasing something in its dreams. Possibly justice. A younger man plays a low, droning tune on a rebec in the corner. The notes are uneven but strangely comforting, like the musical version of trying to walk on a frozen pond and almost falling every few steps. You sip the last of your drink and step outside again, where the night has finally taken full hold. The sky is velvety blue, pinpricked with early stars. Down the road, you hear distant laughter. The village seems lighter tonight, as if the spectacle of justice, however odd, has shaken off some of the week's dust and labor. You pause on the bridge and glance back at the town. One of the abbey's windows still glows faintly. Someone's copying another animal verdict, probably. A rooster, maybe. Or a mole. Surely there's a mole trial in some forgotten archive. It occurs to you then that these proceedings weren't really about guilt. Not always. They were rituals, ways of making sense of a chaotic world. Where crop failures, disease, and death might strike without cause, blaming a goat was weirdly reassuring. At least someone, or something, could be held accountable. It wasn't madness. It was control. Even if that control was doled out in Latin verses to a very confused chicken. You continue walking, each step quieter now. The world has dimmed to a whisper. You think back on that pig, tiny hooves clicking on the stone floor, pink ears twitching, eyes bright with curiosity or indigestion. Either way, it played its part in the great theater of medieval justice. And so did you. Morning returns not with a fanfare but with a soft exhale, the kind that creeps in under shutters and settles on your skin like mist. You stretch in your narrow bed, the straw mattress crackling faintly beneath your weight, and for a moment you half expect to find a parchment summons rolled up by your door. You are hereby requested to appear in court on behalf of an unusually mischievous duck. No summons, though. Just a loaf of bread that's gone suspiciously chewy and the faint clink of buckets being filled at the well outside. You splash your face with water cold enough to question your life choices, then amble into the square again, following your nose toward whatever is baking behind the tavern's crooked kitchen. You pass a merchant setting up his stall, gently arguing with his donkey, who remains unimpressed by the concept of profit margins. The man waves you over, keen to share more tales now that you've got the air of someone who knows their way around a good animal indictment. Ever hear of the caterpillar excommunications? He says, tearing off a chunk of honeyed bun and offering you half. Happened more than once. Poor monks would go out and sprinkle holy water across entire fields just to warn them off. You raise an eyebrow, picturing a solemn procession of clerics chanting psalms over lettuce. Didn't always work, he admits, chewing thoughtfully. But occasionally the bugs would vanish. Divine miracle? Or coincidence? Historians still argue. You wander away chewing your bun, which is mostly crust but still oddly satisfying. Your path takes you past the abbey again, where a scribe is copying out legal precedents in a script so small you're not entirely convinced it's humanly legible. He pauses only to wet the quill or mutter something under his breath about pigs with too many witnesses. Nearby, a traveling friar is preaching to a half-circle of townsfolk. His voice rises and falls with the rhythm of someone used to open-air sermons, and though his message is ostensibly about sin and redemption, he throws in a jab about pigs being the more honest confessors, at least. The crowd chuckles. You edge closer, curiosity piqued. He's holding a weather-stained booklet titled Of Beasts and Burdens, Trials of the Lower Orders. Probably apocryphal. Possibly hilarious. The friar continues, in 1254, in Savigny, a sow was hanged for infanticide. 2 piglets, her own, were spared. Their crime? Merely being present. You squint. That's like arresting a chair for witnessing a robbery. But, the friar adds, because the piglets hadn't bitten the child, they were declared innocent by mouth. You nearly snort. Now I ask you, he says to the crowd, what is the moral here? That pigs are dangerous? Or that humans are oddly thorough? The crowd doesn't seem to know, but several people nod solemnly anyway. You linger just long enough to hear the end of his sermon, something about mercy and breakfast, before stepping back onto the road. It's grown warmer now, the sun turning the cobbles slightly tacky underfoot. You take a turn toward the outskirts, where the town's modest courthouse looms with all the architectural ambition of an upturned barrel. Inside, a clerk is sorting through a heap of scrolls tied with bits of string and wax. He sees you and waves one lazily. Missed the case of the goose last month. Shame. She had a real presence. You don't ask what the goose did. Instead, the clerk offers to show you an older volume, trial records from nearby hamlets. You settle onto a bench as he unrolls a parchment that smells like a cross between old bread and rainy socks. One record details a dog sentenced to death for theft. Another, more peculiar, involves a colony of moles relentlessly disrupting ecclesiastical land. The verdict: they were offered an alternative dwelling spot and threatened with anathema if they returned. You wonder what the moles decided. As you read on, a pattern begins to emerge, not of justice as we know it, but of ritual. These weren't courts in the modern sense. They were performance, logic turned theatrical, where villagers played out fears too big to name directly. Sickness, famine, misfortune, they all needed shapes. And sometimes, those shapes had hooves. A bell rings outside, calling attention to the noon market. You rise and make your way toward it, passing a young girl drawing what appears to be a trial scene in the dirt, complete with a tiny pig and a judge in a pointy hat. Who's on trial today? You ask. The duck, she replies confidently. What did the duck do? Stepped on a priest's robe, she says. Twice. Fair enough. You smile and keep walking. The market is a patchwork of burlap sacks, fish baskets, and vegetables that seem surprised they survived the journey here. Amidst the noise, you overhear 2 traders disputing the price of barley, only to be interrupted by a nearby shepherd offering to sell a sheep guaranteed not to bite clergy. You shake your head. This town. A few stalls down, an elderly woman is selling illustrated broadsheets, woodcut prints of famous animal trials. One shows a cow in a courtroom, another a cat on a makeshift scaffold, which, frankly, looks more like a hat rack. You purchase one featuring the infamous boar of Béziers, depicted mid-roar, though the expression looks more like indigestion. The caption reads, "Convicted of trampling 6 cabbages and 1 unfortunate peasant shoe." A classic. You tuck it into your satchel as the wind picks up slightly, rustling your cloak. The scent of roasted chestnuts and old rope wafts past, along with the unmistakable cry of a rooster that seems late to its own performance. Back at the inn, you settle in once more, feeling the day stretch out behind you like an old story. You wonder who first looked at a pig and thought, this one's probably a repeat offender. But as odd as it all seems, there's a strange kind of peace in it. The villagers needed closure. They needed order. And if that came from holding a goose accountable for knocking over an altar candle, well, at least they had a story to tell over cider. By the time the sun sinks behind the tiled rooftops, casting long buttery shadows across the crooked lanes, you've already eaten half a wheel of soft cheese and watched a boy attempt to put trousers on a goat. The goat, perhaps wisely, declined. You don't intervene. You're pacing yourself. It's going to be a long night of folklore and fermented beverages. You wander back toward the edge of the town, near a walled herb garden that smells like someone accidentally dropped a spice rack onto a compost heap. There, hunched beneath a fig tree and chewing thoughtfully on a sprig of sage, is a man locals call Brother Honest. Not because he's particularly virtuous, but because he once confessed to stealing his own shoes to avoid sharing them with his cousin. He nods at you like you're an old friend and pats the bench beside him. You've been hearing the pig stories, he says without needing to ask. Did they tell you about the donkey in Le Mans? You shake your head. This already feels promising. Well, he begins, drawing the words out as if they'd been steeped in mulled wine. There was once a donkey employed by a local miller. Trusted beast. Steady gait. Good with children. Until, one day, it kicked the bailiff. You lean in. Now, the bailiff, he didn't die. But he claimed grievous insult. So they took the donkey to court. You imagine the court clerk noting charges under assault by hoof. Brother Honest continues. The townsfolk couldn't decide whether the animal acted on its own or was possessed by a minor demon. You know, the usual debate. You nod. Of course. Classic medieval dilemma. Eventually, the donkey was acquitted, he says. Declared innocent. But here's the part one love. They gave it a ceremonial wreath and let it walk through town in a little procession. Like some hairy war hero. You blink. That actually happened? Historians still argue, he replies, which you're starting to recognize as shorthand for, it probably didn't, but it's too entertaining not to share. He tells you more, of a rooster arrested in Basel for laying an egg, suspected witchcraft, of beetles that allegedly ruined a bishop's rose garden and were politely asked to relocate, and of a sheep who accidentally wandered into a tavern, drank beer, and became something of a local celebrity until it vomited on the Lord's lap and had to stand trial for public disorder. The details are fuzzy, but the rhythms are familiar now, this blend of storytelling and civic theater, of actual concern and whimsical ritual. You're beginning to understand that these trials weren't merely about assigning guilt. They were about enforcing an invisible order in a world too chaotic to grasp. As the stars begin to prickle the sky, you make your way toward the chapel. Not for prayer, exactly, but for the small library kept by the monks, a haphazard collection of illuminated texts, sermon drafts, and legal codices that smell strongly of beeswax and wet wool. One of the older brothers, Brother Remy, spots you and raises a parchment-stained eyebrow. Here to borrow a book on pig jurisprudence. You shrug. Something light. He chuckles and pulls down a volume titled Speculum Justitiae Animalis, a real page-turner, if your idea of excitement involves 14th century French legal commentary. You open to a random page and read aloud. In cases where the offending beast is deemed unbaptized, execution shall be symbolic but public. You pause. Symbolic and public? That's ambitious. Brother Remy sits beside you, candlelight making his tonsure glow like a tiny sun. You know, most of these cases followed Roman tradition, he says. Livy, Cicero, they wrote of animal punishment too. We just added more flair. He gestures to a nearby illustration. It shows a pig in shackles wearing what appears to be a small, very unflattering hat. Public theater, he says again. Like morality plays. Only with more bacon. You stay for a while, flipping pages, marveling at the footnotes, some of which were clearly added by bored monks with a penchant for sarcasm. One reads, the goose denied all charges. Witness testimony inconclusive. May have been bribed with grain. Eventually, you thank Brother Remy and step back outside. The town is quiet now, windows aglow with firelight, dogs barking lazily in the distance. You stroll past the butcher's shop, where a sign reads, no further trials this week. All pigs currently well behaved. You take the long way around to your inn, passing the old well where teenagers are telling ghost stories. One swears he saw the spirit of a wrongly convicted cow at the edge of the field. Another insists the cow waved. You don't interrupt. At the inn's hearth, a few locals are gathered, half asleep and sipping spiced cider. Someone hums a lullaby, and someone else is trying to remember the Latin term for pig plaintive. The fire crackles like it's in on the joke. You settle into your corner, finally still, finally warm, and think of all the animals who stood where you're sitting, metaphorically, of course. Defendants in trials meant to soothe anxious communities, distract from failing crops, or simply pass the time in a world with long winters and no streaming services. Odd as it sounds, you feel grateful for them. The pigs, the roosters, the overly ambitious goats. They brought structure to a lost system still figuring itself out. They gave storytellers material. And most of all, they made the people laugh. And tonight, so do you. You wake, or more accurately, stir gently, just past midnight to the sound of something boiling. Not ominously, mind you. It's more of a gentle, contented bubbling, like soup in a distant pot or perhaps tar bubbling in a very sleepy courtroom drama. You blink, yawn, and remember that the innkeeper mentioned his wife always made bone broth after sundown, mostly to keep her hands warm while she gossiped. You stretch and tiptoe outside, the cool air crisp and earthy. The cobblestones are slick with dew, and overhead, the stars glint like somebody scattered silver pins across a piece of velvet. Somewhere, an owl hoots, probably judging you for not being asleep yet. You make your way toward the magistrate's square, not out of civic duty, but because there's something deeply comforting about standing where the most ridiculous legal decisions in town were made. It's like visiting the birthplace of absurdity. And tonight, it's quiet. No trials, no scribes, not even a pig in sight. But the air is thick with stories. One, for instance, about a local cat named Blanche who once knocked over a consecrated wafer and was briefly declared an agent of diabolical mischief. She was pardoned after giving birth to 5 kittens, one of which had a tuft of fur shaped like a cross. The monks took this as divine intervention, or possibly a sign of indigestion. You lean against the old stone steps, now worn smooth by centuries of public spectacles. This is where the bailiff once tripped during a goose trial and sprained his pride. This is where, rumor has it, the town's one and only legal ferret was sentenced to exile after stealing a string of sausages from a monk's pocket. The records are fuzzy on whether the ferret served its sentence. Just across from the square stands the records office, a squat, timber-framed building that smells like mildew and moral compromise. You peer in through the shutters. By candlelight, an apprentice clerk is nodding off into a pile of scrolls. Poor thing probably had to summarize 3 decades of animal misdemeanors by hand. Inside those scrolls are things like: a sow accused of persistent grunting during vespers, a hen found guilty of inappropriate nesting on sacred relics, a dog sentenced to wear a wooden collar reading repentant thief after stealing a holy man's sandals. You wonder, not for the first time, whether the scribes added dramatic flourishes out of boredom or genuine belief. Historians still argue whether these proceedings were acts of satire, misguided piety, or a bizarre form of early legal theater that blurred the line between sacred duty and municipal stand-up comedy. And yet it all mattered, to someone. Every absurd trial, every footnote in chicken-scratch Latin, every sentence carried out with solemn ceremony and possibly a very tiny robe. The people who ran these towns, half priest, half paralegal, all exhausted, were trying, in their own way, to make the world legible. If a pig could be tried, it meant the system worked. Sort of. It meant that chaos could be managed. That crime, even the cloven-hoofed kind, had a process. You make your way toward the bakery next. No, not for bread, it's closed, but because the baker's son once testified in an animal trial. He claimed to have seen a pigeon wink at a nun during Mass. Under oath. His testimony was deemed highly suggestive, but inconclusive. The pigeon was exonerated and reportedly moved to a nearby town to avoid further scandal. Near the bakery, a faded carving of Lady Justice looks down at you, blindfold slightly crooked, scales uneven, as though she too has just woken up and remembered she once presided over a trial involving a parrot accused of blasphemy. You salute her with a lazy nod. Wandering further, you pass the edge of the commons, where the grass still holds the faint indentation of benches and crowd footprints. This is where animal trials were often held when the courthouse got too drafty or smelled too strongly of ox. You picture it, villagers in heavy cloaks, children holding honey cakes, and a goat wearing what could generously be called formal wear. You pause by a weathered post where public notices used to be nailed. There's nothing there now but a scrap of parchment, flapping softly. It reads faintly, "Trial postponed. Defendant escaped into Cabbage Field." You're oddly proud of them. It's easy to laugh at all this, and you do, gently. But as the night deepens, your laughter softens into something warmer. These stories may seem ludicrous now, but they were rituals, small, strange gestures that help people cope with the randomness of life. In a world of plagues, bad harvests, and inexplicable misfortune, blaming a pig gave the illusion of control. It was never really about justice. It was about order, about symbolism, and perhaps about giving people something to talk about over weak ale and lentil stew. You find your way back to the inn, where the coals in the hearth have sunk into a gentle red glow. The barkeep gives you a sleepy nod. "Still up?" he asks. "Just walking the town," you reply. "Telling the pigs good night." He grins. "Let me know if one asks for a lawyer." Back in your little room beneath the eaves, you stretch out on the straw-stuffed mattress, wrap the blanket around your shoulders, and let your thoughts wander one last time. Tomorrow, you might ask to see the parchment archive, or visit the mill where a goose once stood accused of undue honking. But for now, you simply breathe, long and slow, and let the absurdity settle in your bones like warmth from a well-tended fire. No matter how strange the world becomes, at least you'll know this: somewhere, once upon a time, a town tried to reason with a pig. And honestly, it made more sense than most things. The sun peeks over the horizon in that quiet, honey-colored way that suggests it, too, has just rolled out of bed and isn't quite ready for drama. You rise slowly, joints mildly protesting, but the air smells like barley porridge and chimney smoke, so you take it as a sign the day will be tolerable at worst, delightful at best. You amble out to the common path, dodging an enthusiastic goose, a half-awake monk with a broom, and a cart carrying suspiciously squeaky turnips. The townsfolk are already murmuring about the next trial. Word travels fast when livestock is involved. This time, it's not a pig, but a cow. Specifically, a cow named Lizette who allegedly trampled Brother Pascal's herb garden while being inexplicably smug about it. You wander toward the monastery, not for prayer exactly, but because monks keep the best gossip, especially the sleep-deprived ones who stay up copying scrolls by candlelight. Today, the cloister is bustling. There's parchment being rolled and re-rolled, a couple of chickens being bribed out of the scriptorium, and a long rope being measured, presumably for courtroom staging or maybe just very organized laundry. A young monk in sandals 2 sizes too big waves you over. They're assigning a legal advocate to the cow, he whispers. Brother Martin. He once defended a sheep who sneezed during Mass. You're not sure what's more impressive, that Brother Martin won that case or that someone managed to document the sheep's alibi. It's a curious system, these animal trials. And more than a little theatrical. The animals are treated with a weird form of reverence, especially the larger, domesticated ones. A sow who injures someone may be shackled, yes, but also blessed. A rooster who crows during the wrong part of a feast might be given a trial, but also dinner before sentencing. Symbolic justice paired with actual hospitality. And always, a human appointed to speak on the animal's behalf. Historians still argue whether this was out of a genuine desire to be fair or simply a way to ensure the paperwork looked more legitimate. Either way, the idea of offering legal defense to a creature who thinks parchment is edible remains one of medieval Europe's more whimsical flexes. The legal defenders were often monks or town scribes, men trained in rhetoric and ritual. They would stand beside the accused and, with a straight face, argue that the goat had been provoked, or that the ox was in heat, or that the pig mistook the altar cloth for grass. And they did it with all the ceremonial trappings you'd expect of a murder trial. Robes, readings, witnesses, even cross-examinations. One such event recorded a donkey trial where the prosecutor grilled a 10-year-old eyewitness for 10 minutes on what precisely the donkey's expression looked like when it kicked over a cart of communion wine. The boy, in his defense, replied, sort of smug. It didn't help the donkey's case. You lean against the stone wall, content to listen as the bells mark terce, and the monks shuffle into their daily rhythm of chanting and chores. Brother Martin passes with an armful of scrolls and a look of grim determination that wouldn't be out of place in a war council. He's preparing his case. Not just for Lizette the cow, but for a principle. In this town, even barnyard beasts deserve due process. Even if they respond to charges by blinking twice and chewing cud. Back at the inn's hearth, the townsfolk gather for breakfast. You take your seat between a baker with flour in his eyebrows and a weaver who insists her cat was once a courtroom witness. Look the judge straight in the eye, she says, then threw up on his boot. That's testimony, if you asked me. Someone else claims their aunt once owned a pig who tried to bribe a court official by dropping truffles at his feet. You'd laugh, except in this town, you're honestly not sure that's fiction. And now, of course, everyone wants to see Lizette's trial. Not because they expect a different outcome, most animals are sentenced to exile or ceremonial penance, but because the whole affair is comfortingly ridiculous. In a world where real injustices often go unanswered, there's something therapeutic about watching a cow get gently scolded for flattening basil. You think of the logistics too. How the monks must prepare the courtroom. How someone has to write the summons. How at least one person is tasked with translating cow behavior into viable legal defense. And yet they do it. Every time. Why? Maybe it's because laws, in this era, are sacred. Not metaphorically sacred, actually woven into religion. Courts often borrow rituals from Mass, and vice versa. Candles are lit. Prayers are spoken. So even if the defendant has hooves and questionable bladder control, the act of holding a trial upholds the divine order. It's all very symbolic. And oddly touching. By late morning, the court square is being tidied. Someone's sweeping last night's goose feathers into a pile. A scribe sets out an inkpot and sharpens his quill with the concentration of someone about to transcribe something ludicrous with absolute seriousness. You watch as Lizette the cow is led into the square, wearing a garland of clover around her neck. The townsfolk part to make room. Children giggle. Adults pretend not to. Brother Martin takes his position beside her, one hand on a stack of parchment, the other resting gently on Lizette's shoulder as if to say, "We've got this." No one really expects a pardon. But that's never been the point. The point is the ritual. The act of taking even the smallest disruption and giving it a shape, a frame, a theatrical little box to place it in. So when something goes wrong, the town doesn't unravel. It puts on robes, appoints a speaker, and tells the world, we are ridiculous, yes, but we are trying. And so are you. You exhale, long and slow, and feel the faint warmth of morning sun on your face. In this town of absurdities, even justice has a sense of humor. And honestly, that feels like the best kind. The trial of Lizette the cow proceeds with the sort of solemnity you might expect from a coronation, if the monarch in question were fond of hay and had a suspicious stare. The judge, a barrel-chested man with eyebrows like snow-covered hedgerows, clears his throat and begins with a Latin invocation that sounds important, though half the crowd is more focused on whether Lizette will relieve herself on the courthouse flagstones. You take your usual spot on the low wall beside the herb cart. It's shaded, moderately cushioned by moss, and directly across from Brother Martin, who now adjusts his robes with the precision of someone preparing to make a spirited defense of a ruminant. Your Honor, he begins, with all the gravity of a seasoned lawyer, my client is a creature of noble lineage, whose only crime was the irresistible pull of mint. The judge raises one thick eyebrow. The townspeople murmur. A child tries to feed Lizette an oat biscuit, and she declines with such disdain it could probably be considered contempt of court. It's not a long trial, but it's lively. The prosecutor, a grain merchant who looks like he's been storing his outrage since harvest season, presents the evidence. a ruined herb bed, 3 bruised leeks, and a shredded prayer flag. His argument is spirited, if a little personal. One gets the sense he has long-standing feelings about livestock and holy spaces. Brother Martin counters with an impassioned appeal to mercy, suggesting that Lisette was under duress from a low-hanging thundercloud and acting on instinct. He cites precedent, referencing a goose in 1268 who was acquitted after pecking the prior's sandals during Lent. Instinct, he reminds the court, is the mother tongue of animals. Historians still argue whether these elaborate defenses were designed to teach villagers respect for divine order or simply to entertain them during otherwise monotonous weeks. Either way, the audience is rapt. The judge ultimately rules that Lisette will be forgiven after a public penance, 3 days yoked beside the town's most disciplined donkey, whose name, bizarrely, is Hubert. She must also wear a sprig of rosemary, the symbol of repentance. The verdict is announced, and the crowd nods, satisfied. Lisette, unmoved, tries to eat the rosemary. Back at the tavern that evening, the stories begin. You sip something vaguely resembling mead while the weaver from before insists that Hubert once dated a warhorse. It didn't last, she says with a shrug. Too much baggage. You let the conversation drift like smoke from a hearth. It's comforting, all of it, the trial, the rituals, the strange logic of assigning meaning to chaos through the framework of courtly performance. Medieval justice, especially when applied to animals, functions a bit like bedtime storytelling. It's not always factual, but it helps people sleep better at night. Besides, it isn't just about punishment. It's about restoration. Penance. Symbolic apologies made through theater. After all, you can't sue a pig for trespassing, but you can bring it to court, declare it reconciled with the community, and then move on. In a world where plagues happen without warning and crops fail for no apparent reason, people find peace where they can. And if that peace requires dressing a goat in ceremonial ribbons and reading aloud its confession, well, so be it. The next morning, you pass the churchyard and find Lisette yoked beside Hubert. The donkey stands with serene dignity. Lisette looks deeply unimpressed. Around them, garlands hang from fence posts, and someone's placed a small sign reading, "Penitent at peace. Do not pet." You chuckle. But there's a strange comfort in it. Even livestock gets a fresh start here. Later in the week, you overhear preparations for another animal hearing, a case involving a fox accused of eating a bishop's laundry. This is met with significant debate about whether undergarments count as holy vestments if they haven't been blessed. At this point, you stop questioning the logic. It's more fun to just follow the thread. These trials, while clearly absurd, also reflect how deeply people in the Middle Ages believed that order could be restored through ritual. That even the unpredictable wildness of nature could be brought into harmony with human life. If a pig disrupts a funeral procession, it must be judged. If a cow crushes a parsley patch, justice demands redress. Not to mention, it's an excellent excuse for a community gathering. No one wants to attend another sermon about eternal damnation, but a court case where a chicken is accused of witchcraft? You couldn't pay people to not attend. You reflect on this blend of the sacred and the silly, how it paints a vivid portrait of the age. Not just the fear and superstition, but the creativity, the need to frame life's chaos in manageable, almost theatrical ways. And truthfully, there's something noble in defending the innocent, even when the innocent is a sow who once stole a candlestick. You return to your inn, where the host has set out a tray of fresh bread and butter pats shaped like saints. The room smells of beeswax and thyme. Through the window, you hear the soft braying of Hubert and the more resigned chewing of Lisette. They've become local celebrities now. In your own quiet way, you start to feel protective of them, your little companions in this strange, orderly absurdity. You imagine writing them letters. Maybe knitting them penance scarves. The day fades, as all days must, and you lie back, imagining the parchment records being filed, the scribes making tiny notes in cramped Latin script, and the courtrooms slowly emptying, echoing with the clop of hooves and the faint rustle of hay. Tomorrow, there will be more squabbles, more rumors, maybe even another trial. But for tonight, Lisette is at peace. Hubert is honored. And the town, for all its oddities, feels just right. The town scribe, a gentle fellow with a perpetually inky thumb and a bald patch that glows softly in the sunlight, is charged with recording the outcome of Lizette's case. You find him hunched over a parchment, tongue peeking out the side of his mouth like a child concentrating on a particularly difficult bit of embroidery. You lean over his shoulder and watch him write, "In the year of our Lord 1286, in the jurisdiction of Saint-Cerice, did the cow Lisette appear before a tribunal to answer for her destruction of herbs belonging to the monastery kitchen." It's all very official, though you catch him doodling a tiny cow in the margins, wearing a rosemary crown, no less. You marvel again at how seriously these records are taken. Animal trials, however absurd they might seem, are treated with the same administrative care as land disputes or tax decrees. There's a dusty wooden cabinet in the town hall filled with scrolls documenting centuries of misbehaving pigs, disobedient dogs, and even a rooster who was allegedly possessed by the devil. Historians still argue whether these entries were meant to be legal precedents or moral tales. Some suggest they served as cautionary parables, others think the clerks just needed something to do between tax seasons. Either way, the documents survive. Which means you now know that in 1259, Auguste in Avignon was found guilty of mockery of clergy. No one remembers how it mocked them, but the image of Auguste honking in Latin is hard to forget. You stroll toward the marketplace, where gossip has ripened like summer pears. The herb seller recounts the trial with wide eyes, insisting Lisette blinked twice during the verdict, clearly showing remorse. The blacksmith says she was trying not to sneeze. A local child claims to have seen Hubert whisper something to her, but no one believes him. Hubert is famously discreet. You overhear two bakers discussing another famous animal case from a nearby town, this one involving a sow who allegedly knocked over a knight's ale at a wedding feast. The sow was acquitted on account of the knight's known clumsiness. There's even a song about it now. You hum along to the chorus. "O brave Sir Cedric's slippery hand lost to a pig and a drinking stand." It's not uncommon for these trials to inspire art, music, and the occasional miracle play. Theater troupes reenact the most dramatic hearings with porcine masks and wooden gavels, leaning heavily on slapstick and moral lessons. You once saw a production titled Boar on the Bench, which was unexpectedly moving. Today's performance, however, is unscripted. A young farmer approaches the tribunal to report that one of his goats has eaten a page of scripture from his wall-mounted devotional. Psalm 23, he explains. Now it's Psalm 22 and a burp. The judge takes this quite seriously and orders the goat to appear for questioning. You wonder what the defense will be: divine hunger? Goatish illiteracy? Back at the abbey, Brother Martin is preparing a small sermon on forgiveness, themed loosely around Lizette's ordeal. He gestures to a basket of rosemary and sage and tells you it's now customary to hang a sprig near the stables, for absolution and improved digestion. You're not sure if he's joking, and he doesn't clarify. The church bell rings, calling the faithful to vespers. As you pass through the courtyard, you notice a cluster of parchment pinned to the monastery door. One is a list of sins eligible for public penance. Most involve ale, sarcasm, or inappropriate whistling. Another is a new law regarding poultry within city walls. The third is a poetic retelling of Lizette's trial in rhyming couplets. You read the opening aloud. In Saint-Cerice where roses grow, a cow did eat, but did not know that mint and time were not her right, and thus she stood in court that night. You stop there. The poem is long, and your feet are sore. Also, you're a little hungry. You drift into the bakery, where the baker has created a limited edition treat in honor of the cow's redemption: rosemary scones shaped like tiny hoofprints. You buy two and eat one slowly on a bench under a walnut tree. It's buttery, crumbly, and faintly ridiculous. There's something in the air now, a shared sense of calm, maybe, or the relief that comes after a village has fulfilled its communal performance of justice and whimsy. The scribes have inked their scrolls. The farmers have had their say. And even the cow, munching contentedly in the distance, seems at peace. Still, the records must continue. The court clerk has started preparing a volume titled Beasts of Trial, Volume 2. You glimpse the first entry, the case of the donkey who brayed during Massachusetts. It promises to be a thrilling sequel. You wonder what future generations will think, discovering these accounts in some crumbling library or digital archive. Will they laugh? Or nod in admiration at how even livestock were given their day in court? Whatever the case, the people of Saint Cerise take pride in their curious brand of order. The scribes write, the bells toll, the rosemary hangs, and justice, however peculiar, marches on. As you rise from the bench and brush crumbs from your cloak, you notice someone has left a small bouquet of wild flowers at the base of Lizette's pen. A child, probably. Maybe a fan. She accepts them with grace, or at least a neutral chew. You head toward the outskirts of Saint Cerise, where fields stretch lazily toward the tree line and the hum of village chatter fades into birdsong and the distant clink of someone hopelessly trying to fix a broken cartwheel. This is where the livestock usually roam, in pastures hemmed with wooden fencing and the occasional very confused-looking scarecrow. A cluster of monks is walking along a path nearby, carrying bundles of herbs and parchment scrolls, presumably some combination of lunch and doctrine. One of them, Brother Seraphine, stops to wave, his face pink from sun and exercise. He gestures you closer, pointing proudly to a small shack near the edge of the field. Inside the shack is a collection of oddities. Bundles of dried lavender hang from the rafters, next to a cluster of brass bells and what looks suspiciously like a carved wooden pig snout on a stick. Brother Seraphine explains that this is the monastic repository of agricultural justice, or as the locals call it, the shed of slightly embarrassing trials. You browse the exhibits. There's a broken plow arrested for sabotage, a goose feather quill accused of scribing false doctrine, and a pair of muddy shoes worn by a cow leading a protest march through a cabbage patch. The shoes are child-sized, which raises several uncomfortable questions. In one dusty corner, there's a painted scroll detailing a famous case from 1273, in which a duck was sentenced to quiet exile for interrupting a bishop's homily with enthusiastic quacking. According to the tale, it now lives happily in a nearby abbey, where it helps wake the novices with its morning honk. You consider visiting it, just for the sake of completeness. Back in the village, a schoolmaster is lecturing his pupils under a sycamore tree. Today's lesson is about civic duty and the role of witnesses in animal trials. Even a pig, he explains, deserves a fair defense. And possibly a biscuit. One student raises his hand to ask what happens if the animal is innocent but tasty. The schoolmaster pretends not to hear. You find your way to the local tavern, which has created a new drink inspired by Lizette's trial. It's called Herbal Clemency and contains apple cider, thyme, and a suspicious hint of sage. The bartender says it's supposed to taste like forgiveness. It mostly tastes like regret and anise. Still, you sip it politely and take a seat near the hearth, where an elderly man is telling a group of travelers about the time a sheep was put on trial for eavesdropping. It was a clever sheep, he insists, and very interested in tax policy. Historians still argue whether animals on trial were really symbolic, he continues, or whether folks were just trying to scare their own livestock into behaving. Someone in the back snorts and mutters that they tried that with their ox, and it only made him more rebellious. From your perch by the fire, you can see a large chalkboard by the tavern entrance. It lists upcoming town events, midsummer fair, barrel rolling tournament, poetry night, and of course, public trial of Henrietta the hen, weather permitting. You circle it on your mental calendar. You step outside again, just in time to see a group of children acting out Lizette's trial in miniature. One plays the cow, chewing with exaggerated solemnity. Another wears a mop on their head and shouts, "Objection! She's chewing my rosemary." A third bangs two ladles together and declares, "Order! Order in the barn!" It's surprisingly well rehearsed, and you find yourself rooting for the mop-headed lawyer, who closes his case with, "If the time fits, you must acquit." The audience, 3 chickens and a dozing hound, seems satisfied. You wander down toward the stream, where a cluster of women is washing laundry on smooth stones. They're discussing the possibility of writing a collective letter to the bishop, asking for guidance on how to distinguish herb theft from mere grazing. He's got experience with complicated cases, one says, wringing out a tunic. Remember the affair with the drunken squirrel? Another nods solemnly. Justice was swift and nut-based. In the cool shade by the stream, you pause to rest. The water makes a sound like someone practicing lullabies on a harp made of tin spoons. Birds flutter between the branches above, and a small frog near your boot appears to be humming. A group of apprentices wanders past, arms full of scrolls and empty inkpots. They're arguing about how best to illustrate the next trial document. I say we include speech bubbles, one suggests. It makes it more accessible. Another grumbles that pigs don't speak Latin, and the whole thing is absurd. Still, they agree that a cow-shaped initial would be charming. Back in the heart of the village, the council has convened to discuss standardizing sentencing for future animal infractions. One proposes a points system, another suggests mandatory penance via carrot donation. The eldest counselor sighs and mutters, "In my day, we just yelled at them and moved on." As evening draws near, the town begins to settle into that soft lull where chores taper off, and dinner smells start sneaking out through windows. You can hear the gentle sound of someone humming a hymn nearby, possibly Brother Seraphine again, judging by the occasional hiccup of a misplaced Latin phrase. A local priest walks by carrying a crate of rosemary plants, muttering, "This is going to get out of hand, I just know it." You pass the town square one last time before heading home. Someone has added a sign beside the water trough, "Public Grazing Zone." Time free since Tuesday. Lizette herself is there, lounging behind her newly reinforced fence. She eyes you as if to say, "I told you the time wasn't worth it." And honestly, it probably wasn't. You rise early the next morning, though not as early as the monks, who are already chanting somewhere off in the misty distance. The bell from the abbey tower rings out, crisp and confident, like a goat announcing it has a better place to be. The village of St. Cerise is slowly yawning into life, smoke curling from thatched chimneys, doors creaking open with a sort of sleepy reluctance, and one blacksmith loudly grumbling about his missing hammer. Again. As you stroll down the dirt path, a rooster eyes you suspiciously. Perhaps word of Lizette's trial has made its way to the fowl community. Maybe he's worried about being next. Maybe he's just cranky before his first corn. Today, you're meeting with the notary, a man by the name of Gerard, whose job it is to officially record the results of animal trials in his oversized, buckled ledger. The thing is practically a piece of furniture. It takes 2 people to lift it, and 3 to find anything in it. You suspect it might also double as his dinner table, footrest, and possibly sled in the winter months. Gerard greets you with the enthusiasm of someone who hasn't spoken to another adult in 3 days. He insists on showing you his favorite trial entries, which range from a frog accused of disturbing the peace to a goat whose official charge was excessive smirking. You lean in, squinting at the faded ink. Yep. Smirking. Historians still argue whether that one was a mistranslation or a deeply personal vendetta. The goat's punishment? Community service, mostly weeding the herb garden, under close supervision. Over tea, Gerard explains how animal trials were part of a broader cultural belief system in medieval Europe. Everything has a soul, he says, or at least a moral obligation. That includes pigs, goats, cows, geese, and once, allegedly, a cricket that interrupted a wedding sermon. The cricket was never caught. It's probably still out there, tapping away smugly on some barn rafter. You ask if every trial is taken seriously. Gerard chuckles. Oh, heavens no. But the formality gives people comfort. It makes nonsense feel a bit more sensible. Like pretending bedtime rituals will actually stop your thoughts from galloping across 7 embarrassing memories and an imaginary grocery list. Outside, a group of schoolchildren has arrived for a civic lesson. Gerard begins dramatically reading one of the entries, embellishing it with theatrical pauses and eyebrow lifts. The students giggle and gasp in all the right places. One of them tries to object to the verdict, and Gerard bangs a spoon on the table with surprising authority. You drift from the notary's hut to the village bakery, where the morning bread has just come out of the oven. It smells like warmth and soft rules. The baker, Madeline, slides a loaf into your hands before you can protest. For keeping calm during chaos, she says with a wink. Apparently, Madeline has been chronicling the village's animal trials in her own way, through pastry. Today's special is the Lisette tart, made with apples, thyme, and just a pinch of smugness. The secret, she confides, is cooking the thyme until it stops acting innocent. You nibble the corner. It's alarmingly good. Possibly better than actual justice. In the town square, someone's put up new notices. One is an ode to Lisette, written in trochaic hexameter and signed only A. Scribe in shadow. Another invites villagers to attend a mock retrial next week, featuring sock puppets. The third is a flyer for Pardon My Pasture, a one-act play about a chicken falsely accused of inciting unrest. You sit on a bench near the fountain and watch the village hum. Children chase each other around wooden carts. A dog naps in the shade, twitching with what you can only hope is a dream about rabbit diplomacy. An old woman tosses breadcrumbs to birds with the precision of a sniper and the kindness of a saint. The mayor walks past, inspecting everything with a furrowed brow. He mutters something about standardizing livestock moral codes and continues on his way, one boot noticeably squeakier than the other. You wander to the edge of town again, where the church bells toll the hour. Brother Seraphine is in the garden, praying over his carrots. They grow straighter when they're blessed, he insists. Except the rebellious ones. He gives you a crooked carrot with a shrug. Still good in stew. Back in the barnyard, Lisette watches you from her paddock. She's standing beside a new sign that reads, "This animal has stood trial. Please respect her legal experience." Someone's tied a small ribbon around her horn. It's blue. It probably means something. The village cobbler, Francois, invites you in to show you his latest creation, trial-ready shoes for livestock witnesses. They're mostly decorative, made of stitched leather and reinforced with something he calls judicial twine. You ask how many pigs he's measured. 2. One was cooperative. The other had opinions. The discussion turns to fashion, specifically the ceremonial garb worn during certain animal trials. In one case, a rooster was dressed in a miniature bishop's robe as a joke. The villagers laughed until the rooster escaped and terrorized the bakery for 3 days. Historians still argue whether that event was divine retribution or paltry coincidence. By now the sun is beginning to dip. Lanterns are being lit. The town takes on that golden hush that happens just before supper. Someone is playing a lute badly, but sincerely, near the tavern steps. You pass the fountain again and see a pair of ducks sleeping with their heads tucked in, as if trying not to get dragged into legal proceedings. Gerard waves at you from his doorway. There's a rat on trial next week, he calls. Allegedly stole some candied almonds. Very high stakes. You promise to attend, then find your way to your lodgings above the stable. The scent of hay and old wood welcomes you like an eccentric ant. You stretch out, hearing the faint shuffle of hooves below and the comforting creak of beams overhead. It's been a long day. A good day. A wonderfully strange and time-scented day. You wake slowly, wrapped in the soft scent of hay, dust, and something faintly herbal, likely the remains of last night's Lisette tart clinging to your dreams. Outside your window, the dawn rolls in with a rosy sigh, and a rooster gives a triumphant crow, probably taking credit for the sun again. Below you, hooves shuffle. Lisette is stirring. It's hard to tell if she remembers the events of her trial, or if she simply regards the entire affair as a strange but necessary performance. Like nobles pretending they understand peasants, or monks pretending their candles don't drip wax everywhere. You step down from your loft, stretch, and find the stablemaster's cat curled atop your boots like a guardian spirit in low form. She yawns, flicks an ear, and goes right back to ignoring you. Today, the village is preparing for a fair, and among the usual stalls, pastry, wool, candle stubs being sold at mysteriously firm prices, there's a new addition, a pop-up court of appeals, manned by Gerard's teenage nephew and featuring a puppet judge with disturbingly realistic eyebrows. You pass by as 2 children plead the innocence of a squirrel accused of hoarding holy wafers. Possibly for winter, they argue, or possibly out of spite. The puppet judge sentences it to community service, organizing pine cones. You're not sure how that's supposed to work, but no one seems to mind. A little further down, you spot Brother Seraphine standing on a crate, giving an impromptu sermon on moral equality across species. "Let he who has not trampled a garden bed cast the first radish," he declares. People nod solemnly, though one merchant mutters something about last week's goat situation. The goat in question, wearing a garland of dandelions, offers no comment. Midday arrives with the slow burn of roasting chestnuts and the energetic chaos of folk music played on instruments that were never really in tune, even when brand new. You sit beneath a tree near the edge of the square, savoring a sweet cake shaped like a gavel. It crumbles in your fingers, tasting of honey and justice. Two elderly women argue nearby about the historical accuracy of yesterday's pig trial. Pigs weren't represented by monks in the 13th century, one insists. They had secular counsel. The other scoffs. And who told you that? That man who thought frogs could vote? Historians still argue whether pigs in medieval trials were appointed religious or lay representation, or, in some cases, represented themselves in what can only be described as snort-based objections. You're invited to the town records office for an afternoon peek into past cases. It's a dusty, cramped room smelling of ink and melted beeswax. The clerk, a serious man named Lucien, adjusts his spectacles and opens a folio large enough to crush an average goose. Inside, transcripts of animal trials dating back nearly a century. Some of them are heartbreakingly sincere, like the 1219 case of a donkey accused of disrupting Vespers, who was ultimately pardoned because it knelt during the final hymn. Others are clearly tongue-in-cheek. One entry simply reads, "Defendant, cow. Charge, looking smug. Verdict, fair." Lucien explains that while some trials were symbolic or performative, others reflected genuine attempts to establish order in a chaotic world. People wanted to believe justice extended beyond humans, he says. It helped them sleep better at night. You nod, sipping something that tastes like cinnamon and clerical patience. As you leave the records room, you're handed a pamphlet, The Ethics of Porcine Prosecution. You skim it, noting footnotes debating whether pigs can possess mens rea, or criminal intent. One scholar suggests they might, particularly if apple theft is involved. Back in the square, you find yourself caught in the rehearsal for a pageant titled The Trial of the Fox Who Fooled the Bishop. A costumed fox, actually a spaniel in a red cloak, sits patiently while a girl recites a dramatic accusation involving stolen bread, impersonation of a monk, and a suspiciously well-groomed tale. You pause to pet the spaniel, who accepts your admiration with the weary nobility of a true thespian. Evening approaches. Lanterns begin to glow, casting gentle halos over the stalls and pathways. A fiddler tunes up beside a soup pot, and the blacksmith's daughter starts handing out ginger biscuits shaped like tiny gavels. You crunch one thoughtfully, enjoying the way it tastes like sweetened bureaucracy. You pass by the paddock one last time. Lisette watches you with calm eyes, her legal ordeal behind her, her future wide open. Someone has placed a crown of herbs on her head, rosemary, lavender, and something that smells suspiciously like sass. A small child nearby is explaining the pig's trial to a chicken, who does not appear particularly moved. The child leans in and whispers, "You're safe. For now." The chicken blinks once and resumes pecking with quiet menace. Later, as you walk back toward your lodgings, the sky spills stars across the countryside like spilled flour. The village is winding down, though laughter and lute music still drift lazily through the air. A group of monks shuffle past, their sandals slapping softly. One hums a hymn that, frankly, sounds suspiciously like "Row, row, row your boat." You curl up again above the stables, a blanket wrapped tight, the sounds of the fair fading into stillness. Outside, Lisette snuffles in the hay. Somewhere, a puppet judge has been tucked away for the night. And the records clerk, Lucien, is likely muttering about footnotes in his sleep. Another day closes in Saint Cerise. Another strange and oddly reassuring chapter in the very curious history of pig jurisprudence. The next morning, you awaken to the soft sound of bells chiming from the abbey tower, 7 slow peals that drift across the rooftops like warm breath in cold air. The stable smells of oats and quiet satisfaction. You stretch, roll over, and nearly squish a scroll someone has left on your pillow, tied with twine and sealed with wax. The wax bears an imprint of a pig's face? How formal. Unrolling it, you discover it's an invitation to attend a mock scholarly symposium on swine sentencing practices. Naturally, it includes a suggested dress code: bring your own snout, if applicable. You're not entirely sure whether this is satire, performance art, or an actual academic endeavor. Then again, in this village, it's probably all three. So you tie on your boots, tuck the scroll into your belt, and head out into the cool morning. The symposium is being held in the Abbey Library, which has temporarily been renamed the Baconian Forum, for reasons best left unexplored. The tables are neatly arranged, parchment and quills laid out for note-taking, and someone has stacked a suspiciously large number of apples by the door for inspiration. The first presenter, a balding monk named Brother Quinton, introduces his thesis with tremendous flair: Moral Agency in Livestock, the Case for Barnyard Intent. You're treated to a surprisingly rigorous breakdown of pig behavior patterns, medieval legal codes, and the moral implications of holding animals to the same standards as humans. A goat in the front row sneezes pointedly during his conclusion, which Quinton takes as enthusiastic agreement. Next up is a lay historian named Agath, who delivers a rousing defense of porcine innocence. Her thesis? Perhaps it was never the pigs. Perhaps it was .us. She goes on to argue that pigs, as communal animals, reflected the social anxieties of their human keepers. You consider this while sipping something that tastes like boiled bark and medieval regret. Historians still argue whether the trials were genuine legal processes, public theater, or simply an elaborate way of venting frustrations at livestock that had wandered a little too freely into human space. During the break, you step into the cloister garden, where the stone benches are dusted with dew and the air smells of thyme and roasted barley. Two novices sit nearby, arguing whether pigs should have been tried by jury or by divine ordeal. One suggests tossing apples into a pond and seeing which one floats toward the pig. The other simply says, "Just ask the pig," and pops a walnut into his mouth. You smile, then glance at the Abbey sundial, which has been modified with a cartoon pig pointing its hoof toward each hour. According to this charmingly inaccurate timepiece, it's now snuffling a clock. Back inside, a third speaker, young Gerard's older cousin, Aloy, presents a treatise on porcine parallels and canon law. His scroll is more doodle than doctrine, but it's oddly compelling. At one point, he compares the life of a monk to that of a pig. Both are kept in walled communities, both follow strict routines, and neither gets out much. Several monks chuckle. One writes that down. By midday, the symposium has devolved into an open debate over whether roosters would make better legal defendants. A woman stands up and claims to have once known a duck who committed tax fraud. You begin to suspect this is less about legal scholarship and more about letting people tell stories they've clearly been holding in for years. Outside, a thundercloud rolls lazily across the sky. The villagers glance up, collectively shrug, and go back to whatever extremely specific task they were doing. You've never seen so many people committed to perfecting the curvature of a turnip peel. Wandering through the village afterward, you pause by the bakery, where a new treat is on offer: oaths of innocence, small almond biscuits shaped like scrolls. You bite two. They taste faintly of lemon, law, and guilt-free carbs. You hear a commotion near the center of the square. Turns out, Lizette has become something of a celebrity. Children parade her through the cobbled streets wearing paper wigs and chanting, "Not guilty! Not guilty!" One child dramatically faints into a basket of leeks when Lizette snorts near her ear. You hope someone's documenting this for future trial reenactments. Back in the Abbey's scriptorium, you catch a glimpse of a monk carefully illuminating a manuscript that includes Lizette's case. Gold leaf glints softly on the words Judicium Porcini, the judgment of the pig. In the margin, someone has added a tiny doodle of a pig winking at the reader. It's likely sacrilegious. It's also delightful. You're invited to stay for Vespers. The service is peaceful, heavy with incense and the echo of plain chant. For a moment everything, the biscuits, the scholars, the legal proceedings conducted by candlelight, feels deeply, oddly sacred. Not because it's solemn, but because it's shared. Afterward, the village slowly dims. Lamps are lit, one by one, and you return to the stables, stepping carefully to avoid a chicken who's clearly still on edge after her earlier legal consultation. Lizette watches you settle into your hayloft, then flops down contentedly, as if to say, yes, this has been a strange week, but it has also been exactly right. The stars emerge. The moon drapes herself across the sky like she's trying to eavesdrop. And somewhere down below, someone begins humming that off-key hymn again. The next day arrives with the distinct smell of rain on old rooftops and a peculiar silence. The kind that only comes when a village collectively decides to sleep in after a very long week of pig trials, pop-up symposia, and an unusual number of almond biscuits. You stretch and yawn in your hayloft, where Lizette is still snoozing beside you, her curly tail twitching with what you hope are innocent dreams. You make your way to the courtyard, where the baker waves you over and slips you another scroll-shaped pastry, this one dusted with nutmeg. Limited edition, he says, with the gravitas of a royal decree. Today, the village is buzzing about something new. A visiting bard has arrived, claiming to have songs about other infamous animal trials from across the land. Naturally, the tavern has cleared space, swept the rushes, and positioned 3 barrels for optimal acoustic bounce. The bard turns out to be a lanky fellow named Theobald with an impressive beard and a lute that's seen better centuries. He introduces his ballad with a flourish, the tragedy of Bernard the Goose, unjustly accused of gander theft. You sip something warm and spiced, and listen as he spins a tale of mistaken identity, a fateful honk in the moonlight, and a courtroom outburst that ended with Bernard flapping out the window. The refrain is catchy. By the second verse, the entire room is humming. Historians still argue whether these tales were embellished folk stories or dramatized memories of real legal practices, but what they agree on is that animal trials tapped into something curiously human: our need for order, meaning, and the occasional poetic absurdity. Theobald continues with a lesser-known saga, The Cow Who Refused to Kneel. Set in a northern village and involving a bishop, a mud puddle, and one very stubborn bovine, it ends with the cow being acquitted but forced to serve penance by pulling a pilgrim cart for 6 months. With full lunch breaks, the bard adds helpfully, "You're starting to wonder just how many animals had legal representation in medieval France." There's a moment when Theobald lowers his voice, leans in, and declares that once, just once, a beetle was brought before a bishop for disrupting a harvest with wanton munching. The beetle didn't appear in court. The weather was blamed instead. After the ballads, a local notary reads aloud from an old scroll he found in his attic, an official verdict from 1296, declaring that a pig named Agnes was guilty of thieving a bishop's lunch and showing no remorse. The notary reads it in a dramatic falsetto, and someone in the back calls out, "Agnes was framed." The laughter is quiet but warm, echoing off the beams as the sun filters in through crooked shutters. Wandering outside, you pass the carpenter's workshop, where someone has carved a tiny wooden model of the trial's courtroom, complete with miniature benches, quill pens, and a remarkably realistic Lizette with a bow on her head. "For posterity," the carpenter says, polishing her snout with a cloth. You stop by the schoolhouse next. The children are writing short plays inspired by the week's events. One group is rehearsing a puppet version of the trial, featuring felt pigs, a gavel made from a spoon, and a judge voiced entirely in oinks. You're particularly impressed by the pig who dramatically faints when the verdict is announced. A future star. In the meadow behind the chapel, a few villagers have begun setting up for what they're calling the Festival of Fur and Feathers, an event to celebrate all animals, whether divine, criminal, or merely opinionated. There are garlands made of rosemary and bluebells, tiny wreaths for hens, and signs that read justice for all creatures, great and small. A goat sneaks a mouthful of streamers when no one is looking. You help string up paper lanterns shaped like pigs and doves and possibly one confused bear. Children dash about with chalk, drawing courtroom scenes on the stone paths, stick-figure pigs behind bars, judges with oversized wigs, and in one case, what appears to be a duck leading a protest. A soft breeze carries the scent of lavender and roasted chestnuts. Somewhere, a fiddle starts playing, and two elderly women begin an extremely slow waltz in front of the blacksmith's forge. No one seems to know the steps, but that hardly matters. At twilight, the mayor, still wearing his ceremonial medallion, which now has a tiny pig charm attached, climbs onto a barrel and clears his throat. As mayor, he says, I officially declare this week the most peculiar in the history of our town. And I include the day of 40 turnips. Cheers. Laughter. Someone throws a wreath. Lisette, newly decorated with a sash that reads Mistress of Mercy, accepts a round of apples with solemn dignity. You sit near the edge of the square, sipping something mulled and gently fizzy. Fireflies blink lazily in the air, and the stars begin their nightly ritual of showing up late and sparkling anyway. It occurs to you that, in a world often chaotic and loud, there's something deeply soothing about a village that treats even its absurdities with reverence and ritual. Whether or not pigs truly stood trial for moral failings, the care taken with each story, each scroll, and each crumb of almond biscuit makes it all feel real. And maybe that's the point. You lean back, watching as villagers and animals alike dance, snort, and shuffle beneath a sky the color of candle smoke. Lisette, full of apples and affection, settles beside you with a snort of pure contentment. Somewhere, a child begins retelling the story of Bernard the Goose to a sleepy goat who may or may not be listening. Morning returns, not with the clang of a church bell or the crow of a rooster, but with the unmistakable sound of Lisette sneezing into your cloak. You sit up slowly, blinking against the soft gray light. Rain clouds stretch overhead like a sleepy blanket, and the ground smells of damp hay and half-finished pastries. The town has returned to its usual rhythm, almost. The baker is back to shaping loaves rather than distributing commemorative ones, the blacksmith has unhung his celebratory banners, and the tavern has resumed its familiar ratio of spilled cider to whispered gossip. But a few pig-themed wreaths still linger, and someone has redrawn the trial's courtroom in chalk on the stones outside the mayor's office. Today, the talk turns reflective. You walk the main road beside a cooper polishing barrel hoops. He's muttering about justice and how some pigs just have expressive faces. That's not a crime. You nod solemnly, because, really, who among us hasn't been misjudged based on our snout curvature? The librarian, who last week insisted she'd seen a mouse sneaking legal scrolls out at night, now sets out a new shelf in the reading corner titled Agricultural Misconduct and Related Offenses. It includes such classics as Goats Who Graze Too Far and the unauthorized tunneling of Badgerkin III. You pause to read the trial transcripts one last time. The scribes have added footnotes, commentary, and in one case, a doodle of Lisette wearing tiny glasses. Under motive, someone has penned, possibly driven by unguarded truffles. Historians still argue whether the pig trials were meant to sincerely enforce moral standards or if they were thinly veiled community rituals, ways to channel fear, guilt, and occasionally, creative pastry making. The debate continues, with some claiming these ceremonies were legal theater, while others point to the expense and formality of the process as proof of genuine belief. You find yourself wondering, if a pig can be brought to court, how many other animals have quietly shaped the rules and rituals of human life. A visit to the nearby monastery reveals another layer to the tale. The monks there, known for their patient script copying and cheese making, once kept detailed records of local animal incidents. One faded scroll lists complaints such as singing frog outside window past Compline and cat interrupting vespers with enthusiastic kneading. The monks resolved most issues with a stern prayer and, in one case, a tiny woolen hat for the offending feline. You're handed a small slip of parchment from the monk in charge of hospitality. It reads, "Let all creatures be judged kindly, for they know not our rules, but only their nature." You tuck it into your cloak. Back in town, the mayor, now back to his regular velvetless hat, waves you over. He's preparing a modest exhibition for the town archive, featuring bits of rope from the courtroom, a photorealistic sketch of Lisette looking regal, and the controversial spoon gavel from the puppet performance. Future generations must know, he says, handing you a thimble of warm clover mead. You sip and stroll. The candlemaker, who made a limited run of pig-shaped tapers during the trial, now sells them as justice lights. Their noses glisten with a hint of beeswax blush, and they come with a tag that reads, "May your evenings be fair and mildly scented." At the edge of the village, you pass the small pasture where Lisette was once held. It's peaceful now, framed by wildflowers and buzzing bees. A boy nearby is drawing a map in the dirt with a stick, labeling it Piggy Province. You ask him what the capital is, and he says, very seriously, Snortsville. Further down the road, the apothecary nods at you from his doorway. "Still think about that pig stare," he says, almost philosophically. She knew too much. By midday, a letter arrives. It's from a neighboring village, inviting your town to a debate, resolved, animal trials as a model for communal accountability. The parchment is sealed with wax shaped like a squirrel holding a scroll. You read it aloud in the square. Cheers erupt. Someone starts making travel snacks. Your role, it seems, is expanding. From witness to chronicler. From biscuit sampler to folk historian. You jot notes on scraps of parchment, documenting Lisette's rise to local fame, the trial's peculiar decorum, and how justice here tasted faintly of cinnamon and crowdsourced forgiveness. Children start referring to you as the keeper of the snout chronicles. You accept with appropriate gravity. Later, as twilight blushes over the rooftops, you wander the outskirts, where a few villagers are building a small wooden structure. "What's this?" you ask. A woman with a hammer answers without looking up, "A commemorative courtroom. For practice. In case the chickens act up again." You nod. Logical. Lisette, now fully back in her element, naps nearby with her head tucked beneath a frond of dandelions. Someone has woven tiny laurels into her ears. You sit beside her, scribbling in the margins of your growing scroll. In the quiet, you hear the faint sound of someone playing the trial's theme on a lute. Yes, someone did write a theme. The stars peek out, slow and sleepy, and the breeze carries a hush over the village. You trace a finger through the dirt and draw a tiny pig in a judge's cap. Tomorrow will bring more biscuits, more stories, and probably a pamphlet titled The Ethics of Snout Justice, a beginner's guide. But for now, the night is still. Safe. Wrapped in laughter, parchment, and the improbable dignity of a pig who took the stand, and won the village's heart. You awaken the next day to the rhythmic creak of a cartwheel and the unmistakable clatter of quills dropping in unison. Someone's printed a commemorative Lisette ledger, and it's being distributed door to door. Your window swings open to a breeze that smells like honeyed oats and morning grass, and down below, the baker is already selling miniature pastries shaped like courtroom gavels. You eat one for breakfast. It is delicious and entirely confusing in texture. By now, the town has slipped fully into post-trial mythology mode. Children skip rope to chants about pigs in robes, and someone's painted a tasteful fresco on the side of the blacksmith's shed, Lady Lisette, hooves resting on a scroll, surrounded by an audience of enthralled ducks. Perspective is dubious. Commitment is not. You head to the square, where a local philosopher, formerly the town's third favorite chimney sweep, has taken to giving lectures titled Oink and Order, on the nature of rural justice. His arguments are meandering, poetic, and involve several metaphors about acorns. A question is posed to the crowd: if a pig can be tried for harm, can it also be praised for heroism? The resulting silence is broken only by the sound of someone dropping a bag of turnips. Thoughtful nods follow. You wander the edges of the village, where the fields yawn into soft gold. There's a bench now, a new one, inscribed with, "In memory of the trial that united us, and confused us equally." Someone has tied a little ribbon to the leg. You sit, let the quiet settle. From this vantage point, the rhythm of medieval life unfolds, threading and threshing, muck and music, order and oddity. Chickens bicker near the grain store. A dog wrestles with a ladle it clearly believes is prey. A young couple whispers nearby, probably discussing if they should elope or open a jam stall. The comforting predictability of peasant routine resumes, but with a new wrinkle, an awareness that pigs are now, officially, complicated. Historians still argue whether these kinds of trials were meant as sincere efforts at legal equity, or merely theater for communities in need of catharsis. One scholar claimed they were elaborate distractions, medieval soap operas with straw instead of scenery. Another insisted they were proto-democratic attempts to place all actions, human or not, within a moral framework, even if the defendant couldn't grasp the concept of perjury. Your favorite theory, though, comes from a local balladeer who summarized the whole affair thus: sometimes people need a pig in court to remember their people outside it. You pass the innkeeper, who's added a drink to the menu called Lizette's libation. It contains clove, pear, and just a pinch of something suspiciously similar to disappointment. It tastes like a moral quandary, chilled. A group of monks visits from a nearby abbey, curious to observe the site of the porcine inquisition. They walk the town like pilgrims, murmuring prayers and occasionally sketching pig footprints in their notebooks. You offer them honey cakes. They accept. They chant a benediction over them. It's all very civil. There's a new mural being painted near the well. This one shows the full courtroom scene: Lizette, the judge, the spoon gavel, the gasping children in the back row, all in excruciating detail, including the embroidery on the prosecutor's cuffs, which may or may not have featured tiny cabbages. You spot your neighbor carefully carving a wooden Lizette figurine. She holds it up to the light, then shrugs. Her ears are too philosophical, she says. Back to the lathe. Down at the docks, where trade carts roll in from neighboring towns, there are whispers of imitation trials. A village a few miles east is apparently trying a goat for causing poetic distress. Another is putting a rooster on trial for waking the mayor's mother too early. You chuckle, knowing the tradition has sprouted wings, some literal. You make your way toward the town archives. The librarian greets you with ink-stained fingers and a mischievous grin. Care to see the updated entry on trial by Snout? She asks, unrolling a scroll with flourish. It's comprehensive, occasionally illegible, and includes footnotes in verse. You contribute your own marginalia: cinnamon biscuits highly influential, see Appendix B. Outside, a few children rehearse a puppet reenactment of the trial. Lizette is voiced by someone doing a very serious British accent, and the judge is inexplicably a frog. The audience claps. One man weeps. Theater, it seems, is alive and well. You pass Lizette once more. She's now referred to as her porcine serenity, and wears a garland that changes daily. Today's is made of violets. She snorts appreciatively when you bow. The sky fades toward lavender. Evening thickens like a soup left on a slow hearth. As villagers light their candles and moths flutter at windows, you retire to your room. You record one last note in your scroll: justice, when wrapped in kindness and community theater, is quite palatable. You blow out your candle. You wake the next morning to a curious absence: no distant hoofbeats, no law clerk shouting about pre-trial hearings, and no town crier doing impressions of pigs. For the first time in weeks, the village is calm. Uneventfully, wonderfully calm. The sun filters through your shutters, casting tidy strips of light across your linen blanket. You rise, stretch, and head to the window where dew clings to the glass like sleepy punctuation. A bird sneezes on the sill. You take it as a blessing. Lizette is not in the square today. She's gone on what locals are calling a retirement retreat, really just an enclosure with better shade and a pile of apples no other pig dares to touch. She has, apparently, become a connoisseur. One villager insists she refuses windfalls now. She only eats apples still attached to the tree, as long as someone else picks them. You stroll past the bakery, where fresh buns are cooling. One is shaped like a scale of justice. Another has little pig ears. You buy both. For research purposes. The town is quietly absorbing its new identity. The carpenter is making tiny benches with little plaques that say things like Snout Bench Number 3 and Oath Takers Kneeler, Do Not Chew. The scribe is collecting townspeople's memories in a bound volume titled Lizette and the Law, an unreasonably detailed oral history. A traveling bard has promised to turn the whole affair into a 4-verse ballad and one interpretive dance. At the center of it all is a growing curiosity, a sort of moral fermentation bubbling beneath the cobblestones. Was justice really served? Or was it all just an elaborate folk ritual with snacks and occasional crying? Historians still argue whether these pig trials were exercises in sincere jurisprudence, or simply community coping mechanisms. Some propose they acted as a release valve, allowing villagers to funnel their anger, grief, and confusion into something contained, theatrical, and oddly porcine. You walk toward the old abbey library, where the monks, now affectionately known as the Oink Order, have published a pamphlet on animal trials and the soul, essays in Bacon theology. It's surprisingly thoughtful. There's even a section debating whether forgiveness applies to beings incapable of guilt. You take a copy, mostly because the cover features Lizette drawn with a halo. In the meadow behind the tannery, a few schoolchildren reenact the trial using sock puppets. Their judge keeps losing her wig, and the prosecution consists mostly of squealing. It's adorable. One parent watches proudly and whispers, "My son plays the spoon." You nod solemnly. A fine role. At market, a merchant tries to sell you a certified replica of Lizette's courtroom trough. You decline politely. He tries again, this time sweetening the deal with a free bag of rosemary. Tempting. Still no. The village elder, who hasn't spoken in 3 years except to request fewer bagpipes at festivals, delivers a short speech from the fountain. Justice, my friends, is not always about right or wrong. Sometimes, it's about remembering not to take your own seriousness too seriously. Applause breaks out. A goose honks in agreement. You find yourself back at the square, sitting under the same tree where you first heard whispers of the trial. The leaves above rustle gently, like pages of a forgotten story being turned. And there it is again, that sleepy comfort of a world trying, imperfectly, to make sense of itself. Through bread and ballads, puppets and pamphlets, troughs and theology, it all folds into the soft quilt of village life. Not neat, not tidy, but stitched with a kind of oddly sincere hope. Someone passes you a scroll labeled Suggested Legal Code Addendum. All trials involving pigs require snacks. You sign it. No hesitation. Later, at dusk, you pass Lizette's enclosure once more. She's lounging in straw, unbothered, the village's most unintentional philosopher. Someone's placed a tiny crown beside her feed bowl. She's ignored it in favor of the apples. Classic Lizette. There's a final echo in the air now, as if the trial has passed into the kind of local memory that outlasts truth. You can already picture the tale told years from now, less about laws, more about laughter. Less about guilt, more about curiosity. And somewhere in the middle, always, a pig who wore no robes but carried the dignity of a town trying its best. You head home, passing a few lanterns swaying in the wind. One is carved with Lizette's snout. Another reads, "Let none be tried without their story told." You light a candle in your window. A quiet ritual. No verdict required. The next morning begins, not with fanfare, but with the gentle thud of rain on thatch and a rooster who seems unsure of his responsibilities. He crows once, forgets the rest, and wanders off to peck thoughtfully at a cabbage. You understand the mood entirely. You stretch, wrap yourself in your cloak, and step into a world washed clean. Puddles mirror cloudy skies, and chimney smoke curls lazily above rooftops. A pot of barley stew simmers somewhere down the road. You inhale. You don't need to know whose it is, you're comforted just by its presence. In the town square, where once you heard oaths and objections, there's now a circle of elderly women playing dice with painted walnut shells. One of them winks and says, "We were the real jury, you know." The others chuckle but offer no clarification. Lizette's enclosure has gained a wind chime and a small reading nook, either of which she uses, of course. The chime sounds lovely, though. Light and tinkly, like a lullaby made of cutlery. A new scroll appears on the public notice board. It reads, "Municipal vote. Shall Lizette be declared village mascot, or supreme chancellor of swine?" Both options have merit. Debate will be held next market day. You make a mental note to attend and bring biscuits. Back at your home, you find a parchment slid under your door. It's a poem written by a child, 6 wobbly lines about a pig who stood taller than kings and never asked for much except maybe some mud and quiet. You stick it to your wall. Frame pending. Later, you help the librarian organize her porcine jurisprudence archive. It now includes the trial transcript, mostly ketchup-stained, 3 woodcuts of Lisette, one of them oddly muscular. A bag of theatrical props from the puppet play, including a suspiciously greasy judge wig. An anonymous note that reads simply, "Thanks for making us think." And laugh. As you file away the last scroll, the librarian leans over and whispers, "You know, no one's sure if Lisette really understood what was happening." You nod. But everyone did, somehow. She smiles. Exactly. The town settles again. Shops close early. A mild breeze scatters the scent of roasted chestnuts and candle wax. Bells toll, not for anything in particular, just to remind everyone that time is passing, and that's reason enough. You take one final walk through the cobbled streets. Every step echoes gently in the damp quiet. A cat follows you briefly, then loses interest. Understandable. As you pass the old mill, you hear someone humming a lullaby with suspiciously pig-themed lyrics. You don't ask. You just let it float past you like the mist over the fields. And there, at the far end of the path, is Lisette herself, resting, noble, slightly muddy, and chewing slowly on something that might be a plum. You bow. She snorts. All is well. The trial is long over, but its spirit lingers, not in judgment or drama, but in stories retold by firelight, in little statues on windowsills, in gentle jokes about courtroom etiquette whispered over tea. It lingers in how the village listens to one another now, with a little more patience and a bit more absurdity. And in that absurdity, you find comfort. Because if a pig can be tried with dignity, if a town can rally behind a hooved defendant and emerge more curious than cruel, then maybe there's hope for the rest of us too. Maybe justice isn't about gavel slams and final words, but about the space it creates for reflection, and the slow, bumbling progress toward understanding, hoofprints and all. You head home. You light your final candle. You close your eyes. And as the breeze stirs your curtains like soft fingers on silk, you drift into dreams of straw-tiled courtrooms, of garlanded pigs, of kind judges and sillier truths. The village sleeps. The story, as always, stays wide awake. Now the lanterns are dim. The cobbled paths are quiet, their stones damp from the evening mist, and every shuttered window flickers faintly with the last golden glow of oil and hearth. The village has tucked itself in, not just the people, but the very walls, the wells, the wooden benches worn smooth by story and time. You lie back now, wherever you are, perhaps in a room not so different from the one Lisette might have dreamed of, a place without crowds or questions, just peace and straw, the occasional apple, and a sky that forgets to hurry. Breathe in gently. Let the sillier details fade into softness, the powdered wigs, the tiny gavels, the ribbon-wearing pig who made everyone pause. Let them become distant little echoes, like bells heard from across a quiet meadow. Let your shoulders settle. Let your mind rest. Tonight, there are no trials left to hold. No cases to argue. No verdicts to pass. Only you, and this moment, wrapped in the hush of a world slowed down. And if your dreams should take you anywhere strange, into scroll-filled archives or puppet courtrooms, or even a meadow where a pig quotes poetry, just nod along. Let the absurdity rock you gently. Let the rhythm of old stories soothe the noise of waking thought. You're safe now. All is calm. The village, the trial, the laughter, the questions, they'll all be here tomorrow. But for now, just drift. Soft and slow. The candle flickers. The wind hums. Sleep well.